Hi, everyone. This is David Peña-Guzmán with Overthink. And I am here today with Michael Madary, who is a philosopher and associate professor at the University of the Pacific, who specializes in philosophy of mind, philosophy of vision, and the ethics of technology. And we're here today to talk about his book, which came out in 2017. And Michael, if I'm not mistaken, the paperback is recently out or coming out very soon. Is this true?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. And we're here to talk about this book called Visual Phenomenology. So, Michael, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, David.
So, I want to begin by talking a little bit about the aspect of your book that sort of frames your intervention into these, philosophical debates about the nature of vision, visual experience, and visual science. And that is the MAR model of vision. So you begin your book by talking about this very influential way of thinking about vision that has largely framed the debate in the 20th and now 21st centuries. And it's a model of vision that paints a very specific picture of what it means to see. And eventually in the book, you're going to move away from this interpretation and this model. And so, just as a way of doing a little bit of groundwork and preparatory work, can you tell us what the MAR theory of vision is and what its basic tenets are?
Yes, David Marr was an influential cognitive scientist. He worked throughout the 1970s. He did a lot. He did some work with neuroscience, with what we would now call computational neuroscience. But perhaps his most influential theoretical move was to suggest that we ought to think about levels of explanation. So he came to believe that the neuroscientific level of explanation is too fine-grained for a successful research program in the cognitive science of vision. So he suggested abstracting away from the what he called the implementational level details, so the details of human embodiment, the details of neuroscience, and treating the problem as a kind of engineering problem. So as a result of that, his model is it's what we might call a feed-forward model, where information is coming in, a light array is coming in, and then a representation is being constructed in a sort of hierarchical, step-by-step way, which uh, ends the goal of the representation then is object recognition. So it's feed forward and passive. And the idea there is that the goal of vision is to construct this kind of detailed internal representation that can then be passed on to cognition so that we can do things in the world, so that we can navigate our world successfully.
Yeah. And so it seems like here what's happening is that the visual system is just taking in information and sort of doing this handing off work before cognition gets involved into the picture. And so there seems to be a separation between, strictly speaking, visual processing and then cognitive operations that would happen, you know, outside of the visual processing module. Is that correct?
That's correct. So cognition is outside, and importantly, for what I want to argue, action is outside. So he kind of brackets the movement of the human body in his model, and what I want to suggest is that's going to miss something important about human vision.
Great. And so the way in which you bring in both of those concepts, which are cognition and also embodiment and embodied action in particular, is through the concept of anticipation, which is sort of the central term in the book. And so I want you to talk a little bit about what it is that you're doing with the concept of anticipation in connection to vision, and how that works allows you then to take a step, over, let's say, this Marian or Marist, I don't know what the proper adjective here would be, theory of vision that seems to kind of keep vision at bay from more cognitive and psychological considerations.
Right. So if we consider the fact, so one main motivation for moving away from Mars model is evidence that we move around a lot when we see. So humans, we move our eyes. several times per second in our waking life. We move our bodies continuously. Um, and the idea I want to, the main thesis of the book is that we should think about vision as an ongoing process of anticipation and fulfillment. We move in goal-directed ways, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. We move our eyes in very precise ways that we very don't often that we often don't think about. And the idea is that we continuously have ongoing anticipations about how the world ought to look as we gain different perspectives on it. Does that answer your question? Or
It
yeah,
does. And, one thing that I really liked about your book is that you turn to Husserlian phenomenology as one of the influences for your thinking, 100 years later about vision. And so I want to spend a little bit more time thinking about this concept of anticipation because the way in which it appears in your book is largely in terms of expectations and predictions that we bring to visual experience, which means that when we see the world, we're not just seeing literally what our eyes are registering, what the retina is taking in, but rather our expectations and experiences sort of create a filter that determines what we see in the first place. But in the field of philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, and also vision science, you point out that there is this kind of split in the way in which people think about anticipation and prediction, because sometimes, especially people who work on predictive processing, and they think about this largely as Bayesian inferences that the brain is carrying out at a neural level and that are occurring at a sub-personal level. So we're not conscious of them. It's just what the brain does. The brain is running all these calculations and operations all the time. But then there's also this other side to anticipation, which is that sometimes we do anticipate things on a more phenomenological register at a personal rather than subpersonal level. So talk a little bit about how you see anticipation. Is it that you think anticipation is conscious? Is it unconscious? Is it happening all the time? Is it only happening occasionally? And yeah, that's an important point.
sure, yeah, yeah. So it's a really a big question in interdisciplinary studies of the mind. How does this subpersonal, fast, automatic neural processing or information processing, how does that relate to the way in which we experience the world? And some people may think, you may sort of take a safe route and say, well, they have nothing to do with one another. We shouldn't look for any kind of connection there. And what I want to suggest in the book is that these predictive models that you mentioned in computational neuroscience that are very popular today share structural similarities with anticipation as Husserl described it in his first person phenomenological studies. So Husserl was very much concerned with this idea or this problem in the philosophy of perception. We can call it the problem of perspective. So we're always stuck in a particular perspective in the world because we're embodied creatures. Yet we perceive objects to have hidden sides, to have parts to
Mhm.
them that we cannot visually access at every instant. So if I look at a teacup on a table, there's the side that faces me. And Husserl's solution to this is that we have the teacup is perceived as being present because we have these implicit anticipations about how it would appear if we were to move around it. So I'm following Husserl here on his view as I read him. These anticipations are fast, they're automatic, they're not easily individuated, they sort of fuse into one another. Um, and it's not something that we have to try to do, it's something that happens automatically as we open our eyes and see the world. It's some sort of this ongoing, fast and automatic process that we don't even have to think about.
Yeah, and it seems like one consequence that follows from this is that, at least in terms of thinking about what visual experience is, it always is more than what is given through the senses, right? There are these hidden sides. Some people in phenomenology or in phenomenological circles often use the language of the virtual. There are virtual
Mm.
dimensions that are given to me virtually because, I don't see the other side of the cup, but it's sort of there in the sense that I can access it through action and I expect it from experience. Is that also how you think about it? That there is more there than just what meets the eye on a
That's right.
physiological level?
That's right. Husserl uses this concept of the horizon. He says he talks about a horizon of determinable indeterminacy. And the idea there is that when we visually perceive the world, we're always kind of implicitly aware that there's more out there. There's always more for us to access, even though our access is limited to this tiny little perspective at one time. So there's always more to it. There's a horizon that we can access through movement, and that we implicitly realize that other people access as well. So we can kind of bring intersubjectivity into it also, which opens up all sorts of new areas for research.
Yeah, and so I wanna also give the people who, you are moving beyond a fair shot here because, you make it very clear from the get-go that your objective in this book is to bring in cognition into our very understanding of visual perception from the get-go. There is no such thing as an unmediated perception of the world that is quote unquote pure, because all those expectations, all those mental priors, let's say, are sort of always working um, in the constitution of our visual world. But you also point out that the people who do try to carve out the what you call the early visual module, the EVM, and try to separate it from anything psychological or cognitive, that they do have some pretty decent arguments in order to make the claim that visual processing is separable from cognitive concerns. And I want to ask you about that because one of the things that you point out as possible evidence for their view and as a possible challenge for your view are optical illusions. Like the illusion where you see the lines with the arrows, and we know that they are the same length, but we just cannot see them as the same, right? There is something about the way in which our brains process that kind of visual information that makes the visual illusion recalcitrant, right? It just doesn't let us see it as what it truly is. And so the reason that this could be construed as a challenge to your view is that when I study a visual or an optical illusion and I learn that the two lines really are the same, even though they don't seem like it seems as if that knowledge on your view should then guide my visual perception, right? If I now know that they are the same, one could argue that this should translate into the dissolution of the illusion, right? Into the disillusionment of vision. And yet it doesn't. And so how do you view the argument about optical illusions in this case? Do you really see it as a challenge to your view that maybe you're punting for, a future time to address? Or is it only an apparent challenge to the way in which you think about vision?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So there are a number of figures who are committed to this kind of isolated early vision module. Jerry Fodor uses that argument of the illusion of the Mueller-Lyer illusion that you're describing. Sidon Pelishin is committed to something similar. And as an historical point, their work is kind of responding to what was known as the New Look psychology made popular by Jerome Bruner in the mid 20th century. And Bruner took a rather, what should I say, a rather strong line about the continuity between cognition and perception. So I don't follow Bruner in that strong line. What I'm trying to do is carve out a kind of moderate middle ground between this thesis that all perception is permeated by cognition, on one hand, Bruner's view. On the other hand, the early vision module, that vision is always completely and informationally encapsulated from our beliefs and expectations. So by carving up that middle ground, I want to allow that uh, acknowledge that as you say, there are clearly cases where what we believe to be true does not make its way into what we perceive. We have these recalcitrant illusions. But on the other hand, I think it would be a mistake. Again, it'd be an extreme view and away from Bruner to deny that cognition can never have an influence, or beliefs can never have an influence on visual perception. And so just to use the teacup example again, if I see a teacup for the first time and you tell me, there's a nasty crack in the hidden side of it, I'll say, "Oh, well, let me take a look at this hidden crack," and I can move the teacup, and as I do, I'll have an anticipation, that I will see the crack there. Now, maybe I'll be surprised, and you were deceiving me in some way, there won't be a crack. But even that surprise suggests, I think, surprise is telling. It suggests that, there was some kind of anticipation going on at this kind of, at the conscious level, or kind of implicitly in the background of our conscious experience. So we can have anticipations, we can have cases, I think, where what we believe permeates into how we navigate the world and what we expect to see, and we're surprised when things don't go as we expect them to. Um, but on the other hand, yeah, there are clear cases where what we believe to be true just can't fix, so to speak,
Mhm.
that perceptual experience. One thing I talk about a lot in the book is familiarity, and this is something that maybe your listeners can relate to. When you travel to, if you travel to a new area, a new environment, initially you there's a sense of unfamiliarity there, and that shows up at the conscious level. That shows up at the phenomenal level. That's one reason why traveling can be so exciting. But then as you become familiar with a new area, those visual anticipations become more determinate, and the familiarity kind of fades away. So I think that's a good way of thinking about how our sort of internal states, our expectations, our cognition, if you like, um, can have a noticeable influence on visual consciousness.
And I like how throughout the book you sort of position yourself between these two extremes that you're here identifying maybe with Fodor, this modularist interpretation of vision as completely isolated from the rest of our mental life. And then on the other hand, potentially this new look movement from the mid 20th century with Brunner as the representative. It is very clear to me how you differ from Fodor and the modularist, because you are injecting these anticipations and these cognitive dimensions. It's less clear to me how you differ from Brunner, because Brunner talks about the ways in which all aspects of our experience and past, past experiences shape the way in which we see things, and that includes it's reminding me of the part of the book where you talk about class and money and coins.
Mm.
That was Brunner, no? Who talks
Yes.
about this. Yes. And so, Brunner, I'm here pulling this from when I read your book a couple of weeks ago. So forgive me if I get the details wrong and correct me if so. According to Brunner, even things like your class position determine the way in which you perceive things, because he pointed to or conducted these experiments where children from lower socioeconomic standing would perceive coins as larger than they truly are, but kids from more affluent backgrounds would have maybe a slightly more veridical perception of coins. And so the point here, independently of the details of that experiment, is that a lot of things about you will shape how you see physical objects and physical relations in your environment. That could include gender, class, race, so on and so forth. So, how do you differ from that side of that kind of polarity? Is it that you just disagree with some of that research, or is it that you think there are some aspects of our experience that do not shape perception?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I don't know if there's a satisfying answer, but my answer I'd like to give is I'll leave that to be an open empirical question. Um, I've been I've been challenged by citing Bruner that there are some methodological worries about his work. I haven't looked into that. So yeah, I mean, I think, and it's a question. I think it's going to be an interesting question for ongoing research. And now that we're able to move virtual reality into the perceptual psychology lab easily,
Mm,
I think it's a rich opportunity for running experiments along the precise lines that you mentioned, taking people from different backgrounds, taking, exploring how diversity can shape perceptual content and those perceptual anticipations. So I yeah, I don't want to take a strong stand either way on it. I think I'll take the safe bet and kind of wait for the wait wait for the experiments to come in and see. I mean, I think that there are clearly cases where our backgrounds do shape how we what we anticipate and how we experience the world. And I think there are clear cases uh, where our backgrounds and our beliefs do not. In the case the case of illusions is strong and it's robust.
Yeah.
It so I don't know. Again, I don't know if that's
Yeah.
satisfying, but I think yeah.
It is. No, it is. It is satisfying. Although in the case of visual illusions, and this is the last question I'll ask you about that.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking a lot about visual illusions only because recently I read a couple of articles about visual illusions in non-human animals. And the fact that other animals experience the same illusions that we experience, but sometimes in the inverse way.
Mm,
So if we see things as bigger, they will see them as smaller. And so there doesn't seem to be consistency across species for this. But my question is not about that. My question is just about visual illusions and why they happen in the first place. Um, is it that there is something just innate in the way in which vision works for the majority of humans? That makes us susceptible to these illusions and that all humans would share independently of culture? Or are these visual illusions maybe deeply ingrained expectations that depend on past experience? Because if so, it would seem that visual illusions are not a challenge to your view at all. They would be further
mm.
evidence for your position, right? If we take the kind of experiential view. So I'm just curious because I don't know this literature, how people working in visual science and the philosophy of vision, how they answer that question. Why do we even experience illusions in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I I don't have expertise on that particular question, but one thing I think that we might want to keep in mind is that there's one well-established view in vision science is that we use cues in order to make sense out of the world. So for depth, for example, to make judgments of depth, occlusion is a good clue for judgment of depth, or location in the visual field. Things that are farther away kind of show up higher in the visual field. So we're using cues to make sense of the visual world. In cases of visual illusions, what what is likely happening is that we're using the wrong cues. We're using the wrong cues to make sense of the world. And as to your question about whether it's innate or something learned, I I, I think it would be best to go on a illusion by illusion basis. I'm aware of some evidence that the Mueller-Lyer illusion, the one that we were talking about with the lines and the tails, that is experienced more by individuals um, who live in artificial environments and architectural environments with right angles.
Mm.
So we see corners and walls, whereas individuals who are living in artificial in around architecture with fewer of those, with more rounded architecture, don't experience the illusion. I haven't looked at the details on that, but that's something I've come across. Um, so, um, yeah, I mean, I guess we could. So, yeah, you raise a really good question, and I see where you're going with it. We we could. I guess the question then that comes up is this how plastic, so to speak, is the visual system? So once you have sufficient experience, in development, for example, in the first few years of life, you have, your visual system is developing. Um, Once that occurs, is it fixed in a way that makes these illusions sort of permanent for your visual system for the rest of your life? Or is that something that could change? Um, Interesting empirical question that you raise. Yeah, I don't have a clear answer for it. I think it's generally a problem in psychology. It's a well-recognized problem by now in psychology that most of our psychological experiments have been conducted on American college students.
Yeah.
So, right. So it's not, so it's a questionable inference to then say, oh, well, these American college students experience these illusions. Therefore, all human beings
Yeah.
for all of history and all of future will experience these illusions in this way. So I think your question touches on a methodological issue that we're becoming increasingly aware of in psychology. And it'll be interesting to see in the future how that plays out. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and the problem with the focus on college students, of course, is that that classic weird problem that
Yes.
these are
Yeah.
individuals who are white, from
Those
like
Western,
educated, yeah,
Western
Western,
education.
sorry,
Yeah.
Western educated, industrialized, and democratic
Rich. Yeah.
societies.
Developed. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but then another problem that I remember reading about from, I don't remember which contemporary phenomenologist, is that also college students, because they're mostly like teenagers, 18, 19, they don't have particularly sophisticated vocabulary for talking about their lived experience. And so it's also a problem of description, right? Of attending to the details of what they're being asked to describe, especially when it comes to sensory experience. So in the case of vision, you ask them, uh, what do you see here? What do you see there? And they often just give a kind of quick and easy response without attending, because that requires training, right? It requires being told sort of what to look for and how to attend to the more difficult parts of your own experience. And, and this is a good segue to the next question that I want to ask you, which is about one of those vague areas, which you call indeterminacy. Because you make the point that any theory of vision needs to do justice to the phenomenology of vision, to how we experience the visual world from our first person perspective. And when we look at it from that first person perspective, what do we really know about vision? We know first and foremost that it is perspectival, right? Like I see the world from this perspective and then I move and then I sort of do that pretension and retention structure that Husserl talks about as a way of constituting the world. So I know that it's perspectival. I know that it is temporal, that my vision unfolds in time. It's not as if I have a photographic kind of experience of the world where it's just beats on a string without a flow. And the third feature of our visual phenomenology that you describe is indeterminacy. There is a lot of indeterminacy in our visual experience. And I think this is what maybe those college students maybe wouldn't be able to describe or talk about, but that's neither here nor there. And I just want to hear you talk a little bit about what this indeterminacy is and how you understand it. Is it that there are things in our world that are vague, but then we just pay attention to them and then they become clear? Or is this a much more structurally baked in feature of our experience, this indeterminacy? And where do we actually see it in our experience?
Oh yeah. Good. Good. Yeah, I'm not familiar with what you're referring to about the issue with the college students' lack of vocabulary. I mean, a lot of you know, a lot of psychophysics is very careful to give the subjects very little room for interpretation. It's very often your reaction time. Do you see it or not? So that brings up some really careful methodological
Mhm.
questions about how we set up our experiments and how much interpretation we're demanding of our subjects. But the indeterminacy that, for the most part, what I had in mind is peripheral indeterminacy. So we move our eyes very often. They're called saccades in vision science. I mentioned them earlier. We saccade 3 to 4 times every second, and when we saccade, we bring the area of our visual environment that is interesting or relevant to us into focus. And one thing that Husserl noticed, he wrote about this, I think, in 1909, is that the area of our visual field that has detail to it is actually very small. There's this large area of peripheral indeterminacy that we typically don't notice because we move our eyes so much. So if there's something off to the side that's relevant to us,
Mhm.
rather than just, not look at it, we instinctively and automatically take a better look at it, bring that into view. And then subsequent work, 2011, there were some experiments where subjects were told to fixate on a dot in the middle of an image, and then that image was swapped out for an image where the area around the periphery was kind of systematically distorted, and subjects were unable to tell the difference between the two. And there's actually another experiment or a demonstration I like to do with my students from Dan Dennett's book, Consciousness Explained, where he said, if you want to notice this indeterminacy for yourself, take a playing card out of a deck and don't look at the value of it, but hold it out like this while you're looking forward. And then slowly, without moving your eyes, slowly move the card into your center of vision. And very often, I'm very surprised at how far my students are typically very surprised at how far we have to move the card in order first to see what color it is and then see the value of the card. So, for the most part, the indeterminacy, at least I think the best way to get a grasp on what I have in mind is to pay attention to this peripheral indeterminacy. Now, we could talk about indeterminacy beyond the periphery. So, I'm working within this Husserlian model of anticipation and fulfillment. We can talk about the determinacy of visual anticipations that are outside of what we're our sort of immediate visual environment, and that gets back to this issue of familiarity. So the less, in general, the less familiar you are with an environment, the more indeterminate your anticipations will be.
Mhm.
So that's the sort of indeterminacy that I had in mind.
Yeah, and it seems then that the indeterminacy would have both a kind of spatial dimension when thinking about the visual field at the periphery versus the center, but also a temporal dimension having to do with the Husserlian notion of the horizon, where that which I am expecting in the near future to come, it's sort of there for me. It's part of my experience, but it is indeterminate to varying degrees,
Mhm.
depending on experience and familiarity and so on and so forth. Now, I want to ask you a philosophical question about this research, because when we think about lived experience, we tend to assume that we have complete authority over what it is and what it means, right? Because it is what we are most acquainted. I know how I experience the world probably better than I know anything else. I will never know any second or third person fact that is published in a scientific article, even if I wrote it myself, with as much certainty as I know my own experience of the world. And so, because we have this intimacy and this sense of authority over experience, we tend to believe that we cannot be mistaken about our own experience. And yet, all this research about peripheral indeterminacy, I think it's fair to say that most people don't really know that, right? That most people don't know that the periphery is indeterminate and that we, in fact, do not see at the periphery of our visual field. That includes like shapes. And we don't really know what's there. And that includes color. The periphery is, just based on what we know about the distribution of photoreceptors, it's colorless. And so I'm wondering what you make as a philosopher of all this research in terms of the problem of self knowledge. And do we know our own experience of the world, or do we, in some ways, need science, in this case, reflecting back our experience of the world in order for us to discover that, oh, I actually have to wait for the card to basically be in
Mhm.
front of my eyes? Yeah.
Mhm.
What's your take on this?
Yeah, yeah, it's tough to say what's in the periphery because is it colorless? Is it shapeless? It's just kind of out there for us to explore. So it's really difficult to articulate this indeterminacy. But the question of self-knowledge, yes, that's a heavy philosophical question for me.
Yeah.
Um, so I think I would want to suggest moving away from this initial presupposition that you mentioned that of a first person authority. So I would urge thinking about self-knowledge as a challenge, that we're as a kind of an ongoing challenge that we each have to take up ourselves. And we can also think about it, sort of take a larger historical perspective on it. Peripheral indeterminacy was discovered in the 20th century. Um, and and we're going to keep our texts that write about them and keep our academic disciplines going and pass that those texts on to future generations, so that we, I think I like to look at the question of self-knowledge in terms of an ongoing project that's I guess primarily taken up within each individual life, um, but then also something that we ought to think about across the human species. That we're just starting to realize the how difficult self-knowledge is, and bringing a bit of humility to that question, I think, is really valuable. And the sorts of questions we might be asking now as academics, as scientists working on these questions, is what sort of work can we do to improve our own self-knowledge and to set up future generations to make progress in human self-knowledge?
Yeah. And not just how little we know about ourselves, but also how unpalatable the answer might be in some cases. Like in this case, what we learn is that we actually see a lot less than we think we do.
Mhm.
It, and it reminds me, I've done myself some work on the philosophy of dreams that has some connection to philosophy of mind and consciousness. And I ran into some research a while back that before the invention of color TV, people across the board thought they dreamt in black and white. And so people were convinced that our dreams are in black and white. And then color TV emerges, and suddenly people start reporting um, dreaming in color. And, of course, there are questions here about whether television caused that change or whether it's something a little bit more complex. Either way, it points to the same underlying philosophical challenge that we think we know what our experience is. And then, something external to us happens and reflects us back to us in a way that maybe we did not expect. Um, but let me conclude here our interview. Thank you. You've been very gracious with your time. I promise it would be shorter than this, but the discussion has been good. And I do have
I
one
agree.
final question. I've have this question about visual content. So you have a whole chapter in the book devoted to philosophical debates about content. And essentially the debate there seems to be about what actually see, right? When we just look around, what is the content of our visual experience? And I want you to say that the question has two sides. One, to say a little bit about what's at stake in this philosophical debate, because it seems somewhat abstract, right? When you talk to an average person and you say, the philosophers out there are bickering about the content of our visual experience, a lot of people would say, well, you open your eyes and you see colors and shapes. That's the answer. But it's a little bit more difficult than that. And so tell me first, what is this debate about content and why it's happening? So the stakes. And then tell me what your view is and sort of how it fits into the landscape of other views that are out there. Sorry, that's a heavy question. Um,
I'll, I'll try to take it. Yeah.
yeah.
So content is it's a technical term in analytic philosophy of mind and perception, and it's kind of short for representational content, which means that it's something with correctness conditions. So if a state has content, it means that it tells us something about the world that's either accurate or not accurate. So really, what we're investigating then is how much and this ties in with questions in epistemology and theories of knowledge, because perception arguably is our primary way of gaining access about the external world. So what kind of content we can get into perceptual states is relevant for questions about justification of beliefs, for example. So that's kind of, it's kind of, we run into the intersection with epistemology fairly quickly. There are also questions, as you mentioned, with shapes and colors. some people take a rather what we might call a low-level content view, where yeah, it's just shapes and colors. Others explore. Susanna Siegel's done a lot of great work with this. Others explore possibilities of richer content. So, can we see natural kinds? If I learn to identify different types of trees, for example, is it
Mm.
is it accurate to say that when I look at a pine, a pine's easy to recognize, I guess. But anyway, if I look at a pine and immediately see it as a pine, is that something done at the level of visual content, or is that a later judgment that I make based on shapes and colors that show up to me in vision? So that's kind of the debate, and then there's a lot of literature on it. My own view is, for the most part, a lot of philosophy of perception has been influenced, for better or worse, by the philosophy of language. So, philosophy of language was dominant in analytic philosophy in the 20th century, and I think we're kind of still dealing with the inheritance of that focus on, if we're talking about the mind, we're talking about propositional attitudes and mental states. And I want to urge, it's time to move away from that. That language. We can talk about propositional attitudes. That's fine. But in important ways, propositions are structurally different than what shows up for us in perception. And it gets back to the features you were mentioning earlier. Perspective, that perception is perspectival, that it's temporal, that it's indeterminate. None of those really show up naturally in
Mhm.
linguistic reports about what we see, at least everyday natural language. We'd have to depart pretty
Yeah.
far from,
I'm wondering, I wonder now, it would be a really interesting, shift of power if we now started, basing our philosophy of language on our philosophy of vision and trying to come up with, a language that is perspectival, that is temporal, and that it is indeterminate. That would be an interesting, philosophical project.
you're right. So let's sort of flip things around. Yeah.
Uh,
So I want to urge that uh, uh, I think we do have perceptual content. Some philosophers
mhm,
deny it altogether. I think we do, and I think it's the content of anticipations, which are ongoing, indeterminate, very difficult to articulate. So even with objects with which we're familiar, the precise way that those surfaces are going to appear to us, we don't have the vocabulary. I mean, normal perceivers typically don't have the vocabulary to describe that. So there's, if you look at some of the work on computer rendering, there's, specular highlights, or those kind of, reflections or specular highlights on my head right now from the sun. But yes,
yes. I was just thinking about the reflection that's coming in from the window. Yeah.
right, right. So we don't typically pay attention to that, but our visual system uses them, and we anticipate how those specular highlights will change as we move. So that's how we make judgments about shape, for example. So I think there's this content going on, but it's very different than the way that we usually talk about what we see in terms of,
Mhm.
in everyday language. Yeah.
Yeah, and, in the book, you talk about these theories of content, like the linguistic theory that what we see are sort of linguistic propositions, like that there are books behind me, or that the sun is shining on you at the moment. You also talk about the photographic theory of visual content where we see pictures and
Mhm.
you say, well, that's not temporal. That's not really how we see, even though people think that that's what it is. But the thing that really took me by surprise, and that's because I don't work in this area directly, is precisely the people that you just alluded to a second ago, the people who say that there is no content at all. And can you tell me just a little bit what it means to say that philosophically? Because it almost sounds as if the people who hold that view believe that we don't see anything, which of course is not quite right.
Mhm.
Um, so, what does it mean to say in the philosophy of vision? And I know this is not your view, it's other people's views, but what do they mean when they say that there is no visual content?
Mhm. Yeah. So I think, to put the view most simply, it's this idea that there is visual experience, and then it's the job of cognition to start making sense of that. Start saying, okay, what should I believe based on this contentless visual experience? So there's nothing right or wrong about vision. The right or wrong, the accuracy or
Mm,
inaccuracy enters when we start saying, when we start taking it and interpreting it to be one way rather than another. And it's kind of, I don't want to get too much into it, but it's kind of detailed. It's kind of motivated by worries about arguments from illusion, arguments from hallucination, and so on. I think one motivation there is to move away from an intermediary representation and to say, no, we have direct access to the world. Sometimes we judge it one way, sometimes we judge it another way. So I think that's another thing that's motivating. It's saying we see the world, and then we add we're the ones who are
Okay.
adding the content. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is very much not your view because there is in that chapter on content where you talk about what is actually given to us at the level of the perceptual field. There is already all sorts of organization and things that appear as wholes with particular meanings that are not up for us to interpret otherwise. And so you give the example of phases and intersubjectivity, which is something that a lot of phenomenologists have written a lot about. Which is that when another person appears in my visual field, I sort of just grasp them as another consciousness, as another subjectivity. Um, in the moment, automatically, I perceive their subjectivity. It's not that I see like the shape of a nose and then later reason my way into thinking that they are another mind. And so, from your perspective, there is content, but it's not just shapes and figures, it's also social content and intersubjective content. And the example of the faces stood out for me, and also the example of the houses stood out for me because you point out that when you see a house, because we already know what a house is, and because we have all these very deeply ingrained expectations simply from living in the kinds of environments in which we live, that a house means social life. It means roads and people and an economy. It just brings all this meaning into the equation. And so, as a way of bringing this now and wrapping it up, I want you to talk a little bit about that. How how do you make sense of the richness of perception, and how far are you willing to take that richness? Is there Are there other things beyond subjectivity and sociality that you would include there? Um, yeah, it's a somewhat open-ended question, but I thought this was a really rich and productive part of the book.
Thanks. Yeah. So yeah, I think that as soon as we open our eyes as competent perceivers, we have anticipations about how the world is. At the most basic level, we don't we all sort of implicitly assume that two physical objects can't occupy the same space. That so we have these very basic, but then we can also develop, as you're indicating, um, types of anticipation that are more culturally contingent. In later phenomenological tradition, Anthony Steinbach's done a lot of work to talk about optimality and normality as it's constituted across generations, and that optimality and normality. And I think that this thinking of visual content in terms of anticipation and fulfillment, as Husserl did, really leads quite naturally into an analysis of how things like optimal ways of engaging with our material environment. And these are already intersubjectivity because we learn how to engage with tools, with technologies from others as we develop, and then we pass those tools along. We imitate one another, and those norms, of course, can vary across cultures. So yeah, I think it leads really nicely and without a lot of strain into a kind of a rich analysis of our intersubjective world that we share. So it's a powerful tool, I think, that can lead um, into these higher levels of richer content.
Great. Well, Michael, on that note, I thank you for your time here with me, for chatting with us about visual experience. And for our viewers and listeners, check out Michael Madary's book, Visual Phenomenology from 2017, if you are looking to dig into the details of this philosophical and scientific research. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. It's been great.